James quietly opened the door to his apartment, feeling the weight of fatigue after a long night shift. The hallway greeted him with darkness and silence, but something immediately felt off. A sense of unease, barely perceptible, like a whisper at the edge of his consciousness, began to grow. He stepped inside and noticed small details that didn't fit the familiar picture of his home. The shoes he had neatly left at the threshold were scattered across the floor. One boot had ended up at the far end of the hallway. This couldn't be a coincidence. He had always been careful, locking the door and never leaving things in disarray. James slowly moved deeper into the apartment, trying to understand what was happening. His eyes scanned the familiar objects, but the room, once cozy, felt foreign. The towel he had left on the chair was thrown to the floor, and the coffee table was pushed aside. The glass cracked, and a picture frame featuring him and his younger sister had fallen onto the couch. James's heart began to race, the feeling of impending threat becoming almost tangible. The doors and windows were locked, adding to the confusion. How could someone have gotten inside? He checked the lock on the front door, and it was intact, with no signs of forced entry. This didn't seem like an ordinary burglary. There were no signs of violent intrusion or sounds indicating anyone else's presence. James walked into the kitchen, his hands instinctively clenching into fists. His cup sat on the table, but it now contained remnants of water, even though he distinctly remembered it being empty when he left for work. This no longer seemed like a coincidence. The presence of someone else in his space felt almost palpable. He stood there, gazing into the darkness of the room, feeling fear slowly creep into his mind. Exhausted from chronic sleep deprivation, James finally decided to buy thick curtains to improve his sleep routine. Working night shifts had long deprived him of a normal schedule, and he could no longer endure the constant feeling of fatigue. One morning, after another shift, he hung new dark curtains in his bedroom, hoping they would help create the illusion of night during the day. The heavy fabric instantly absorbed the light, plunging the room into near absolute darkness. James sighed with relief, hoping that now his sleep would be more restful. However, peace did not last long. From the beginning, strange, inexplicable occurrences continued in the apartment. He tried to ignore the little things, keys that ended up in odd places, books that seemed to shift on the shelves. But as time passed, these minor details began to disturb him more and more. Especially at night, when he lay in the dark, in a room filled with eerie silence. Sometimes he heard faint creaks of doors. They seemed to open and close by themselves, even though there was no draft. A few times, as James drifted off to sleep, a dull, sudden light startled him awake. Lamps he was sure were off would turn on by themselves again. This began to frighten him. He would get out of bed, approach the switch, ensuring that there was no light, and then, returning to bed, hear that soft click as if someone had turned the lamp on again. At first, he attributed it all to his fatigue and built-up stress. "I must just be so tired that I'm not noticing when I do all this myself," he reassured himself. But with each passing day, that explanation grew less convincing. A sense emerged that there was someone else in the apartment, invisible but always nearby. One night, he woke to a loud noise. The living room door slammed shut on its own. James jumped out of bed in panic, but upon stepping into the hallway, he found only silence and emptiness. Everything seemed in place, but fear had already settled firmly in his mind. Now, every step, every movement felt suspicious. Even in the dark, he sensed that something unseen was watching him. James's life had turned into an endless series of anxious moments. He began to listen intently to every sound, glancing around when he was home alone. Sleeping became nearly impossible. Every creak, every rustle made him flinch and peer into the shadows. Returning after another night shift, James felt completely drained. With each passing day, his anxiety intensified, as if an invisible weight pressed down on him harder. He automatically turned the key in the lock and entered the apartment. Everything appeared in its place, nothing suggested anything unusual. However, when he walked into the living room, his gaze inadvertently fell on the door leading to the balcony. It was ajar. James froze in place. A second passed before his mind registered that something was wrong. He could swear he had meticulously checked all the locks, including this door, before leaving for work. The balcony had always been a point of focus for him, locked tight. He slowly approached the door, his fingers trembling as he touched the cold handle. It moved freely. The lock was not secured. A ringing began in his head. An inner voice insisted that this was just a mistake, ordinary forgetfulness, but every sensation in his body told him otherwise. He had always been extremely careful, especially after the strange events of the past weeks. No, the door could not have been left unlocked. Someone had been here. James swung the door wide open and stepped onto the balcony. The wind gently stirred the curtains, and the cold air flooded into the apartment, but everything around him was empty. No one was hiding around the corner, and no signs of a break-in were visible. He cautiously examined the railing and the tiles underfoot. Everything was in place, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But this did not bring him relief. On the contrary, the feeling of dread only intensified. Returning inside, James closed the balcony door behind him and checked the lock several times. He tried to calm himself, convincing himself that perhaps he had indeed forgotten to secure the door in his rush to leave. But no matter how hard he tried, doubt lingered. For the first time, he had a genuine suspicion that someone from outside was behind what was happening. Now, every corner of his apartment felt like a potential threat. He slowly moved through the rooms, checking every lock, every door and window, but found nothing amiss. Everything was as usual, except for the persistent feeling of an alien presence. Questions swarmed in his mind. How could someone have entered if the locks were always in order? And most importantly, why? From that moment on, James could not shake the thought that his apartment no longer belonged solely to him. An invisible, uninvited guest could come at any time, leaving no traces. One morning, after James had struggled to fall asleep again, he woke up with a heavy sense of anxiety that had seemingly followed him for days. He automatically reached for his phone to check his emails and notifications when he noticed one message that made him sit up abruptly in bed. On the screen was a notification from the bank. His credit card had been used for several large purchases he knew nothing about. For a moment, James felt his heart stop. He scrolled through the message, hoping it was a mistake. The amounts were staggering: expensive electronics, furniture, something from a jewelry store. He hadn't made any of those purchases. He could hardly believe his eyes. Thoughts raced through his mind like madmen. How could this happen? His card had always been with him, and he hadn't given it to anyone. Confused, James hurriedly opened the banking app and began reviewing recent transactions. Everything was as stated in the notification. For the past few days, someone had been spending huge amounts from his account, and this wasn't just a random small charge. These were significant purchases made at stores he had never visited. He immediately called the bank, trying to keep his voice steady despite the tremor of panic. The operator politely confirmed his suspicions. His card had indeed been used physically at various locations around the city. This revelation hit James hard. He couldn't comprehend how this was possible. After all, no one had stolen his card, it had been with him the entire time. "I need to block the card," he quickly said as the operator finished outlining the transaction details. "I didn't make any of these purchases." His request was processed swiftly, and the card was blocked. But this didn't provide him any relief. Sitting on the edge of his bed with the phone in hand, James realized that the situation extended beyond a simple financial loss. It was something much more unsettling. His financial security was at risk, as was his personal space. Someone was deliberately intruding into his life, invading it with such precision that he began to feel utterly helpless. Suddenly, everything happening around him started to form a terrifying picture. The oddities in his apartment, the unlocked balcony door, the moved items, now they no longer felt like mere figments of his imagination. Someone was not only intruding physically into his life but also financially. This uninvited guest was not just a curious observer. They were acting methodically and cautiously, as if exploring his weaknesses and comfort zones. Once the call with the bank ended, James sat in silence, feeling his heart pound in his chest. The anxiety that had once been a mere background noise had now transformed into full-blown panic. James couldn't sit still after what had happened with his card. All day, he was haunted by the feeling that he no longer controlled his own life. Everything was becoming increasingly strange and frightening. Determined to take action, he began meticulously searching his apartment, hoping to find any clue that could explain the bizarre occurrences. He checked every room, opened drawers, and peeked into closets, but found nothing unusual. But as he approached the storage closet, something inside triggered a quiet, barely perceptible alarm. The closet had always been filled with old items, boxes, and rarely used junk, but this time James scrutinized it more closely. In the corner, behind several old boxes, he noticed a black bag that immediately caught his attention. He didn't remember ever seeing this bag before. James's heart raced as he crouched down and carefully pulled it out of its hiding place. The bag was dusty but not as old as the other things in the closet. A thought flashed in his mind: where did this come from? As he opened it, a cold wave of fear washed over him. Inside were items that didn't belong to him. A pair of sunglasses, an old mobile phone with a cracked screen, a watch with a black strap, and several personal items, things he had never seen and certainly hadn't purchased. His stomach dropped when he found one more thing: a small notebook lying at the bottom of the bag. He cautiously took it out and, feeling his breath quicken, began flipping through the pages. The first few sheets were blank, but then notes appeared. The words were written in a neat but unfamiliar handwriting, one that James didn't recognize. The notes seemed strange, but one word immediately stood out: balcony. It was a precise mention of the door he had recently found unlocked. As he continued to read, he discovered details about his routine: when he left for work, when he returned, and even which stores he visited on his way home. Someone had been watching his life closely, noting every minute detail. A chill ran down James's spine. This was more than a simple intrusion, it was real surveillance. Someone was not just entering his home but was meticulously studying each of his moves. Now everything began to form a horrifying picture. The uninvited guest wasn't merely entering his apartment. This person had been following him for a long time, knowing everything about his life and habits. The bag filled with strange items, the notebook detailing his movements, it all seemed part of a meticulously crafted plan. James sat in the small office of the police station, nervously rubbing his hands together. Opposite him at the desk was Detective Stephen McGraw, a middle-aged man with a weary expression. His jacket bore the stains of old coffee spills, and his eyes reflected the experience of someone who had seen it all and long ago ceased to be surprised. But now, that experience gave James no comfort. He knew his story wouldn't be taken seriously. "So, Mr. Harper," McGraw began, lazily flipping through his report, "you claim that someone has entered your apartment, used your credit card, and left a bag with belongings that don't belong to you." James nodded, trying to remain calm even as anger boiled within him. He needed someone to finally understand the gravity of the situation. But the detective's face showed that he regarded the whole matter as just another mundane case of fraud. "I understand that this sounds strange," James started, "but it's much more complicated. This isn't just a case of theft or fraud. Someone is watching me. I found a notebook that outlines my routine. It even mentions the balcony that I discovered unlocked. This is more than just a card crime." McGraw sighed and leaned forward slightly, his hands folding on the table before him. His expression became even more skeptical. "Listen, Mr. Harper," he said slowly, carefully choosing his words, "we get dozens of these cases every week. Fraudsters find ways to access personal data, forge cards, and make purchases in your name. Just because you found an open door doesn't mean someone is deliberately hunting you down. Maybe you just forgot to lock it." James felt a wave of irritation rising within him. He hadn't forgotten. And it certainly wasn't that he accidentally left the door unlocked. The bag filled with strange items, the detailed notes on his routine, everything pointed to something far more sinister. "I didn't forget," James snapped, feeling his voice tremble with tension. "I always check the locks before I leave for work. I found belongings that weren't mine. Someone is specifically watching me and following my every move." McGraw looked at him as if trying to determine whether James was exaggerating. Sympathy flickered in his eyes, but there was also clear skepticism. "I'll check the information on your card," he said, raising an eyebrow. "We'll find out who made those purchases, and if someone broke into your apartment, we'll handle it. But as of now, we have no evidence that anyone is deliberately watching you. This could just be an unfortunate coincidence, you understand?" James clenched his fists, trying not to lose his cool. All this talk about coincidence felt insulting. What was just another case to McGraw was a real threat to him. He needed the detective to grasp that this was far more serious than mere fraud. "This isn't a coincidence," James said firmly. "I know someone is watching me. And it has been going on for a long time. McGraw sighed again, this time deeper, jotting something down in his notebook. We'll be in touch, Mr. Harper. James returned home after he met with Detective McGraw, feeling overwhelmed and frustrated. The police were reluctant to take his words seriously, only deepening his sense of helplessness. Every time he tried to find answers, the situation seemed more convoluted. He was convinced that something was happening behind his back, but proving it was becoming increasingly difficult. As soon as James closed the door to his apartment, his phone buzzed. A message. He pulled it out of his pocket and froze when he saw the sender's name, Kara Lowell. His ex-girlfriend, with whom he hadn't spoken in years. The last time they had met was under unpleasant circumstances, and since then, all communication had ceased. James slowly unlocked his phone, still processing the fact that she had re-entered his life. We need to talk. It's important, the message read. For a moment, he just stared at the screen, unsure how to react. Why had she suddenly decided to reach out after all this time? And most importantly, why now, when his life was starting to unravel? A suspicion crept into his mind. Was Kara somehow connected to what was happening? He struggled to gather his thoughts, but nothing seemed to fit together. Deciding it was better to find out directly, James replied succinctly, "Where and when?" An hour later, he was sitting in a small cafe on the outskirts of town, waiting for her arrival. Inside, he was torn by conflicting emotions. On one hand, he wasn't ready to see Kara after everything that had happened between them. On the other, he needed to determine if she was involved in the strange events that had consumed his life. When the cafe door swung open and Kara walked in, he recognized her immediately. Time hadn't changed her much, she still had long dark hair and expressive eyes. But something about her demeanor was different. She looked anxious, almost lost. She quickly spotted him and approached, taking a seat across from him while avoiding his gaze. "Hey, James," she said quietly, as if unsure of herself. "Hey," he replied, trying to mask his tension. "I'm surprised you decided to reach out." Kara sighed, nervously tapping her fingers on the table. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. "I'm sorry I stayed silent for so long," she finally looked up at him. "But right now, something else is important. I heard you're in trouble. I can't explain everything right now, but believe me, I have no malicious intentions." James regarded her with suspicion. The whole conversation felt strange. Why was she suddenly concerned about his issues after years of silence? "What do you know?" he asked coldly, unable to hide his distrust. "Why did you decide to show up now? Is this related to what's happening to me?" Kara bit her lip, clearly hesitating. She was tense, as if afraid to say too much. "I don't know all the details," she began, avoiding his gaze, "but I heard that someone is watching you. I wanted to warn you that it could be more dangerous than you think." James's suspicions deepened. Her words only heightened his paranoia. How did Kara know about the surveillance he had just discovered? And where could she have gotten that information? "How do you know this?" he asked, beginning to lose patience. "You've been out of my life for a long time. And now you suddenly show up claiming someone's watching me? Do you think I'll believe this is a coincidence?" Kara took a deep breath and looked him straight in the eye. "This isn't a coincidence, James," she said softly. "But believe me, I'm not involved in this. I have my reasons for staying away, and I can't explain everything right now. Just be careful." Her words sounded like a warning, but not enough to inspire trust in James. After he met with Kara, James couldn't shake the feeling that everything around him was either a series of strange coincidences or perhaps a cleverly orchestrated game. Her warnings, incomplete answers, and sudden reappearance only fueled his paranoia. More and more details began to raise his suspicions, one of which involved his neighbor, Thomas Gray. Thomas had lived in the apartment across the hall for a few months. A quiet, reclusive man, James barely interacted with him. They seldom exchanged greetings, and Thomas had never drawn much attention. However, in recent days, James began to notice odd behavior. Every time he returned home after his night shift, the light on Thomas's balcony was on. James couldn't recall the last time he had seen his neighbor engaged in anything, but now Thomas seemed to spend every evening on the balcony, staring into the darkness. At first, James dismissed it, but after Kara's warnings and talk of surveillance, he became more vigilant. One evening, as James sat by his living room window, he accidentally noticed Thomas again on his balcony. He stood still as if searching for something. James thought it might just be a harmless habit. But something in his neighbor's behavior seemed off. Thomas was too focused, as if he was searching for something specific. The next day, James decided to watch more closely. He settled near the window to observe Thomas. At first, everything appeared normal. Thomas stepped onto the balcony, lit a cigarette, and gazed at the night sky. But then something happened. Thomas suddenly turned towards James's apartment and seemed to stare directly at him. James's heart raced. It was a long, probing gaze, as if Thomas suspected something. But what? James quickly backed away from the window, trying not to reveal himself. A growing anxiety surged within him. Was it a mere coincidence, or was Thomas truly watching him? All the strange occurrences, the unlocked balcony door, the mysterious bag, and the surveillance, made James increasingly suspicious. And now, Thomas had become his prime suspect. Over the next week, James began to conduct his surveillance. He tried not to attract attention but checked on his neighbor every night. Thomas continued his suspicious behavior. He would step onto the balcony at the same time each evening, standing motionless, sometimes jotting down notes in a small notebook he held. This only intensified James's suspicions. He started to convince himself that Thomas might be connected to the events unfolding in his life. One evening, when Thomas again stepped out onto his balcony, James decided to take action. He slowly approached his balcony door, trying not to make a sound. He wanted to find out what his neighbor was up to. Hiding behind the curtain, he cautiously peeked out and saw Thomas once more scribbling something down, then turning to scan their shared courtyard. Whatever it was, James knew one thing: Thomas was hiding something. James could no longer sit and wait for the situation to resolve itself. Everything happening, the odd behavior of Thomas, Kara's warnings, and the unexplained events in his apartment, made him feel cornered. He decided to take matters into his own hands and conduct his investigation. The only way to know what was happening while he was away was to install a hidden camera. Choosing the right device wasn't difficult. A small camera disguised as an ordinary clock was perfect for remaining unnoticed. James bought it from a local electronics store and carefully set it up in his living room, aiming the lens at the door. He knew this alone might not be enough, but at least he could start. If someone truly entered his apartment, he would finally uncover the truth. The plan was straightforward. James decided to alter his schedule. Instead of going to his night shift and returning in the early morning as usual, he called in sick and arranged things to make it look like he wouldn't be home all day. However, he planned to return unexpectedly when they least expected him. Anxiety mounted. Once the camera was set up, he checked its functionality meticulously. A small indicator light blinked, confirming it was recording, and James felt a slight relief. Now he just had to wait. On the day he changed his routine, everything began as usual. He left his apartment like any other day, ensuring everything was locked up. But instead of going out, he headed to a nearby cafe where he could quickly get back home. He chose a table by the window, ordered coffee, and pretended to be engrossed in his phone, though his mind was consumed by one question: who could be entering his apartment when he was gone? Hours passed. James anxiously checked the time, feeling the tension build. He didn't know what to expect, but he hoped the camera would help him lift the veil of mystery, even slightly. Finally, when it was around 3 in the afternoon, he decided it was time to act. Rising from the table, he paid his bill and headed back to his apartment. As he returned home, James tried to stay calm. His heart raced, and he caught himself wondering whether he was ready to see what the camera might have recorded. However, too much was at stake. As he approached the door, his hands trembled, but he forced himself to act. Stepping inside, the first thing he noticed was the eerie silence. Everything seemed unchanged, but the air felt oddly heavy. James quickly moved to the camera and removed the memory card. He couldn't wait to see what had transpired during his absence. Connecting the card to his laptop, he began to review the footage. For several hours, nothing happened: an empty room, soft lighting, silence. But then, to his horror, he saw the door slowly open. A shadow flitted through the doorway, and someone cautiously entered his apartment. It was Thomas. He walked in as if it were his own home, confidently, without a hint of doubt. Thomas scanned the room, as if checking for something, then casually approached James's desk. His heart sank as he watched, frozen in place, unable to process the situation. What was he searching for? And why had he entered without any regard? James needed answers, and this would be the turning point. He had to confront Thomas, even if it meant facing the unknown. As the recording continued, James knew he had to act quickly. The time for questions was over. The mystery was deepening, and James was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. James sat in front of his laptop screen, unable to tear his gaze away from the recording. Everything he suspected had now been confirmed, but what he saw only intensified his anxiety. The footage from the camera showed Thomas, yet something far stranger occurred shortly after. Thomas left the apartment a few minutes later, having done nothing overt, though James was sure his neighbor had been searching for something specific. He scanned the room as if hunting for clues and left as quietly as he had entered. But when James decided to fast forward the recording, hoping to uncover what else might have transpired, he was in for a shock. The video revealed that an unfamiliar figure returned to the apartment an hour after Thomas's departure. This time, the figure was barely visible in the dim light, moving with much more caution. Dressed in all black, the stranger's body was completely concealed, and their face was hidden beneath a mask. James realized immediately that this was no ordinary intrusion. The figure's identity remained concealed throughout the video. They moved slowly around the apartment, seemingly checking every corner and cabinet. It looked like a professional search, methodical and unhurried. The intruder opened drawers, inspected shelves, and peered into places James would never have thought to look. James's heart raced. This was no longer just about a neighbor acting suspiciously. Everything pointed to the fact that he was indeed being watched, and someone connected to Thomas was intent on acting more decisively. The intruder's identity was a mystery, but their presence in his apartment confirmed one thing: the danger was real and closer than he had thought. Fear gripped James's mind. How long had this been going on? How long had he been under surveillance, with intruders slipping into his home unnoticed? Perhaps these people knew every step he took, every plan he made. He realized that his apartment was no longer a haven. Everything he considered personal space was now accessible to someone else. He replayed the recording several times, but nothing new emerged. The figure moved so skillfully that the camera barely captured their actions. No clues, no hints as to who this could be. But one thing was clear: this person had come here with a specific purpose. Panic overwhelmed James. He didn't know how to react. Call the police? Detective McGraw had already shown his skepticism. And without clear evidence, his claims could be dismissed again. James knew the situation was becoming increasingly dangerous, and time was running out for him to take action. His thoughts raced in different directions. He needed to protect himself somehow. But how could he, knowing that he was being watched and his home was no longer safe? James understood that each passing day made the situation more serious. There was only one thing left to do: find answers faster than his adversaries could make their next move. He shut the laptop and stood up from his chair, feeling a shiver run down his spine. There was no time to wait. Every moment was now precious. James couldn't sit idly by, knowing that his life depended on how quickly he could act. He gathered all the evidence he could find: the video footage, notes on strange occurrences, and all the records that pertained to his suspicions. Kara's words about needing to be cautious echoed in his mind. Now more than ever, he realized he was on the edge of disaster. Steeling himself, he headed to the police station. Every step toward the doors felt slow, but James knew he couldn't stop. He entered the building, and though his heart raced in his chest, he did his best to mask his emotions. Detective McGraw sat at his desk, absorbed in paperwork. James approached him, feeling fear and anxiety swell within. When the detective looked up, James saw a mixture of confusion and slight distrust in his eyes. "Something new?" McGraw asked, closing the documents. "Yes," James replied, taking a deep breath. "I have evidence. It's serious." He quickly laid everything out on the desk: the laptop with the recording, paper copies of his observations, and even photographs of the strange bag he had found in the closet. McGraw examined the materials closely, and James noticed his expression shift to one of seriousness. "You're claiming someone is breaking into your apartment?" the detective asked, stroking his chin. "And that this is happening regularly?" "Yes," James confirmed. "I saw it on the video. Someone is entering my apartment, and it's not Thomas." I don't know who it is, but I feel like they're preparing for something. I'm scared to stay here. McGraw fell silent, processing the information. He no longer seemed as skeptical as before. James felt that this was his moment. All right, the detective finally said. I'll start an official investigation. But you need to understand, we need more data. We can set up surveillance, but we need to ensure you're safe. Try to stay with someone as much as possible. James nodded, but his fear did not dissipate. Time was against him, and every moment felt like a threat. He didn't know when the intruder might return, and the thought that his life depended on the police's sluggishness added to his anxiety. When will you start? He asked, anxiously biting his lip. We'll begin in the next few days. I'll assign a team to keep watch over your apartment. But you need to be cautious and not give in to panic. That's important. James clenched his fists, but anxious thoughts still swirled in his mind. McGraw, seeing his distress, added, if anything happens, call immediately. Don't wait until it gets worse. James left the station, but even with McGraw's promise, his heart wouldn't settle. He knew that while they were investigating, the intruder could appear at any moment. Once back home, he turned on his laptop again and began reviewing the recordings, hoping to find something that could help him unravel this mysterious threat. But within him grew a sense that time was running out, and the intruder might act faster than he expected. He couldn't remain in ignorance. The situation was becoming increasingly tense, and James knew that with each day, he was hanging by a thread. With each passing day, McGraw's investigation yielded more unexpected findings, but they brought James no relief. The police conducted their checks, but the deeper he delved into the details, the more convoluted everything became. His initial confidence in solving the mystery began to wane. The police interviewed Thomas, and his alibi for the day James noticed the first alarming activity in his apartment seemed impeccable. He had been at work, and several colleagues confirmed this. Yet, James's suspicion continued to grow. He couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas knew more than he was letting on. Then there was Kara. She reached out to see how James was doing. His heart sank with worry when she offered help, reminding him of the good times they had spent together. But James couldn't shake the sensation that her interest in his situation went beyond mere concern. Initially, she seemed genuine, but soon he felt her words masked something deeper. The police also checked surveillance footage in the area, but nothing suspicious was recorded. James felt his doubts intensify. Someone had managed to hide their actions, and he didn't know how to proceed. Tension mounted. Every evening, returning to his apartment, he searched for even the slightest clues, traces, items that could give him a hint. But instead, he found himself sinking further into confusion. All he could do was monitor every step around him, which only heightened his paranoia. One night, as he prepared to go to bed, James noticed that something had changed in his desk drawer, where he kept notes and documents. At first glance, everything looked the same, but one sheet was out of place. A wave of anxiety surged through him. He pulled it out and saw that it was his investigative plan, on which someone had written comments and notes. Someone was indeed watching him. Reviewing each line, he noticed that some entries were circled. Those were the moments when he mentioned Kara and Thomas. His heart raced as he realized that his thoughts weren't just simple assumptions, they were taking shape as a real threat. Perhaps someone was trying to confuse him, leading him toward false conclusions. With each passing day, he felt less confident that he could expose the true culprit. False alibis, tangled evidence, and the suspicious behavior of his closest acquaintances made him wonder if he was alone in his fears. But until he could unravel the ongoing events, every detail could be crucial. James understood that now he not only had to defend himself but also try to figure out who was truly behind this game. Each new step and each new discovery led him deeper into darkness, and with each passing day, he realized that time was running out. James spent sleepless nights combing through the video footage, scrutinizing every detail in hopes of finding a clue. He flipped from one video to another, sifting through frames when suddenly something strange caught his attention. In one moment, as an unknown figure entered his apartment, a silhouette flickered in the background, seemingly passing by the window. It was so subtle that James hadn't noticed it at first. Seconds passed as he zoomed in, examining the details. For a brief moment, he saw something familiar, the shadow of a person in a blue jacket. James furrowed his brow, trying to recall where he had seen that silhouette before. He stood up, rummaging through his memory until it struck him. It was his neighbor, Alex. They had never been close, but James remembered seeing him several times when he left his apartment. Overwhelmed by this realization, James began to search for further evidence. Soon, he found information indicating that Alex frequently visited a local cafe and had friendly ties with Thomas. This coincidence felt too contrived, yet no matter how much James tried to convince himself otherwise, his intuition whispered that Alex was the key to unraveling the entire situation. He needed to act fast to seize this opportunity. He called Detective McGraw, unable to hide his excitement. "I have a name," he said, trying to sound calm. "It's Alex, my neighbor. He might somehow be involved in this." Together with Detective McGraw, James devised a plan to catch the perpetrator. They decided to employ a strategy they believed would ensure success, setting a trap to force Alex to reveal his true intentions. James intentionally left the balcony door open, feigning ignorance about the ongoing situation. He knew Alex would likely see this as an opportunity. He and the detective agreed that the moment Alex chose to take advantage of the open door, the police would be ready to apprehend him. That evening, while James was alone, he kept watch from the kitchen, hidden behind tightly closed curtains. His heart raced as he anticipated what would happen next. Every second felt like an eternity, and in his anxiety, he tried to calm himself, repeating that everything was going according to plan. Finally, he heard a rustle on the balcony. Alex cautiously opened the door and, after ensuring no one was home, stepped inside. James felt a rush of adrenaline. He wanted this to end swiftly so he could finally uncover the truth. As Alex stepped into the apartment with a confident smile, Detective McGraw signaled his team, and they rushed in, surrounding him. James felt the tension dissipate as the police apprehended Alex, but his joy was short-lived. "What's going on here?" Alex asked in confusion as he was grabbed. "You know why you're being detained," McGraw replied, stepping closer. With each passing second, it became increasingly clear that Alex was not just a pawn. He knew far more than they had assumed. During the interrogation, Alex began to divulge his motives. James stood aside, unable to believe his ears as he learned that Alex was part of a larger scheme. He hadn't just been stalking James. Alex had been watching him for a long time because he was friends with James's ex-girlfriend, who couldn't come to terms with their breakup. He sought revenge for being ignored. Now, all the suspicion, all those times James had felt uneasy, fit together into one coherent picture. When Alex finally uttered the words that sent James's mind reeling, he realized he had become a victim of a meticulously planned deception. His world crumbled as he understood that he had trusted someone who had exploited his fears and vulnerabilities for their ends. All his efforts, his investigation, and even his friendship with Thomas were merely pieces of a more complex game. Now that the veil of mystery had been lifted, James looked at Alex with bitterness and confusion. This was more than just a game. It was a betrayal he could neither forgive nor forget. After Alex was apprehended, James felt the weight lift off his shoulders at last. He stood in his apartment, staring at the emptiness around him, as if this nightmare had just ended. Now he could breathe easy, but there was something elusive in the atmosphere, a lingering question that would trouble him for a long time. Detective McGraw was finishing up the paperwork, preparing to hand the case over to the court. He turned to James to discuss the next steps. "We'll keep an eye on Alex, but you need to stay vigilant. He's not the only one who might be interested in you," McGraw warned, stressing the importance of not losing awareness. James nodded, realizing that his life would never be the same. He decided to change his surroundings by moving to a different neighborhood, hoping to escape the dark memories that lingered within the walls of his apartment. He needed a change to feel safe again and regain control over his existence. He began spending time with friends who had supported him through the tough times, soon noticing that even the simple joys of life started to instill hope in him. In the mornings, he went for runs, and in the evenings, he developed a habit of trying out new recipes. Each step toward recovery felt like a small victory, allowing him to break free from the chains of the past. However, deep down, James knew that some questions remained unanswered. He didn't understand why Alex had chosen him as a target. What other secrets could be hidden in his life that he was unaware of? Who else might benefit from his downfall? These thoughts plagued him like a shadow that refused to leave. One night, while gazing at the starry sky from the balcony of his new home, his phone suddenly vibrated. A message from an old acquaintance he hadn't seen in a while appeared on the screen. "Hey, long time no see. I have information that might interest you." James's heart raced. He sensed that this could be the beginning of something new, or a continuation of what he had already endured. But this time, he was ready. He steadied himself and replied, "Tell me, I'm listening." The next morning, he woke up feeling that a new path was unfolding before him. He was no longer a victim, he was a person ready to fight for his life. A spark of hope ignited in his heart, yet the unanswered questions still stirred in his mind. It was a time for new opportunities, but also a time for investigations. Everything was just beginning.